Johnny? Hello guys, welcome to the current affairs session where I'll be discussing all of the important topics that are necessary for UPSC. Right, I'll be discussing today's paper, that is 1st April. Finally, the month March has ended with all of the atrocities that have been happening. So let us understand what are the important aspects that are present in today's newspaper. Right. I looked at the newspaper writing. There's no concrete information that is important for UPSC. I found some editorials that were little relevant to understand, right? Sometimes it is not only for UPSC, but it's also for your knowledge development, right? You need to study to ensure that you're not behind on the aspects that are going around in the world. So let us start. The first editorial that we're discussing is the West Asian Cauldron of Conflict and its fallout. Basically, it is saying that the West Asia, there's a war, right? And this war is escalating, right? When did the war start? The war started on 28th February, right? And this is April 1st. April 1st and 28th February, it has been a long time, and the war has been continuously going on and on and on. But what we need to understand is the consequences of the war on India as well as the globe, right? So the editorial is saying that there's a West Asian crisis that is going on in the world and that is affecting India, right? Even after the decline of leaders such as Ayatollah Khamenei, the war is still going on. That shows the strength of Iran, right? Editorial is saying that despite the death of leaders, right, the war is still going on. This means that it is going to be long-term in nature. But what you need to understand is there is no peace, right? There's no peace and there's no full war. There's no peace and then there's no full war. What does it mean? It means that it is going to be long-term in nature. What you also need to understand is that the other country that is fighting Iran is Israel, right? Israel is more on a religious agenda rather than on a economic agenda, unlike USA. Economic agenda because USA is more behind the barrels of oil that is present in Iran, whereas Israel's main idea of Iran is that to ensure Israel sustains, right? Because Israel includes Jewish people, which is totally against the Islamic regime, right? So Iran is totally against Israel. That is why, and Iran in previous times has also tried to tell that it is going to ensure that Israel is not present. So it is indirectly saying that it's going to bomb Israel. So Israel had its concerns that it is and those concerns are actually survival. So yeah, what you need to understand is that while Iran and Israel are fighting, whenever you see it is the strong person versus the weak person, and whenever the fight is between a weak person and a strong person, obviously a strong person wins. And in this situation, Israel is weaker and Iran is stronger because of the area or the amount of control that is there. Right? That is the reason even USA is attacking, because it wants to keep its hegemony, right, in the West Asia, and the only country that is controlling the hegemony in West Asia is Iran. So to ensure that the control does not go away, USA is trying to attack and Israel is trying to attack because it wants its survival. Again, what you need to understand is that there's no peace and there's no full war. The author is saying that this can turn into a full world war. The author of the editorial says that this tension can rise into a full world war, mainly because of the oil reserves, because oil amounts 30% of Strait of Hormuz supply, right? 30% of the oil supply needs go through the Strait of Hormuz, and whenever the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, there's a global tension around. And the author says that this can lead to a world war because many other countries could join when there is a disruption in the oil supply in their country. Because whenever there's a disruption in the oil supply, let's say is the oil supply, right? Is the oil supply, this is the X country that's going there. Whenever there's a disruption in the oil supply, let's say there's a West Asian tension, right? The USA, Israel, and Iran war, right? Whenever there's a tension in the West Asia, the oil supply is cut off. When the oil supply is cut off, the oil supply is also disrupted, and the country gets less amount of oil. Due to less amount of oil, the economic conditions worsen in the country, right? Due to which it will have to take what you call drastic measures to ensure that their sustenance also there. So whenever a war like this is going on, other countries might join. So that is what the author is trying to say. The author is trying to say that we think that this war is just between USA, Israel, and Iran, but its consequences can be long-term, and that long-term consequence, which can be drastic, can be world war, right? I don't think world war will happen, but then again, if Iran is really not backing down and USA is also not backing down, then I think a small world war can be a consequence, I guess, right? Because almost 3 countries are there. Russia will join, or China will join, or any other country. For example, Iran has attacked Dubai, right? So UAE might join. You never know which country might join which side. At the end of the day, even India might join some aspect, right? It's saying there's a non-alignment movement, but then again, the recent actions by India do not show a non-alignment movement. What do you call policy? A neutral policy is not being shown because it is. They have a national interest in USA and Israel. So that is what the author is trying to say, that the global tension in the West Asia is not only confined to the West Asia, it can creep to the world and could lead to a world war. Keeping that in mind, let us understand what are the important aspects of oil, right? India stands 23rd in the world global oil reserve. World oil reserve? Global oil reserves, right? India stands 23rd in the global reserves, meaning it has 4.089 billion. That's 4.089 billion worth of reserves. Just imagine India with 4.089 billion of oil reserves is at 23rd. Imagine the first country that has the highest amount of oil reserves, and that is Venezuela. Venezuela has the highest amount of reserves, right? It has around 300 billion barrels of reserves. Then comes Saudi Arabia. And lastly, there is Iran. Iran stands in the 3rd place of the number of oil reserves, right? Oil reserves. But then again, what we also need to understand is that in situations like this, oil is very, very much important, right? So countries have their own strategic reserves to ensure there is a buffer whenever there is tension around the world. So let us look at the countries and how many months can they sustain without an oil supply. Before that, let us recap. Here, India stands 23rd in the global oil reserves, which is having around 4.089 billion of oil reserves. First being Venezuela, second being Saudi Arabia, and third being Iran. Now that we've understood all of this, let us look at the strategic reserves of each and every country, right? India has oil reserves up to 64 days, meaning that if the current war that is going on, if it continued till another month, India wouldn't have a problem. Okay, and the oil reserves in India are at 3 places, right? One is at Visakhapatnam. Visakhapatnam is one area. Then the second area is Padur. Padur is in Karnataka. And lastly, the other one is Mangalore. So these are the 3 places where we have strategic oil reserves present to ensure that we are sustaining for over 64 days. 64 days even when there is a global tension happening. And in the first position, we have Japan. Japan with over 260 days. 260 days of oil reserves worth, right? Then we have China. Then we have Singapore. Singapore with 245 days of oil reserves. Then we have South Korea. South Korea with 210 days of oil reserves. And fourth, we have USA with 200 days of oil reserves. As you can see, the tension is between Iran and USA. Iran stands third in the world global reserves, meaning it has lots of billions of oil reserves present. So there is no issue for Iran at all. Secondly, USA. USA has 200 days of oil reserves, meaning that it can fight for almost 6 months. Right? Even if it fights for 6 months, there's no need for USA to go to another country and beg for oil. So at the end of the day, they both can fight for a long term. When they both can fight for a long term, the consequences are not confined to them. The consequences show a ripple effect that go on to the other countries such as India and dependent countries such as China, Pakistan, or any other country, right? Whenever these kinds of things happen, all of these are the repercussions that are present in the global field, right? So that is what you need to remember, that India has 64 days of oil reserves, and the locations in which they are present is Visakhapatnam, Padur, and Mangalore. And Japan has the highest number of reserves with 260 days of strategic reserves. Next being Singapore with 245 days of oil reserves. Third being South Korea with 210 days, and fourth being USA with 200 days of oil reserves. I just wanted you guys to remember all of these information because these kind of information is required in mains. You can quote in USA, you can quote it in mains in such a way that whenever there's a global tension, the countries which have higher advantage have less consequences, whereas the countries having low advantage have more consequences. Meaning, USA and Iran having high oil reserves and high oil presence have less consequences, whereas countries like India and Pakistan or Sri Lanka or any other neighboring countries that we are talking about have higher consequences because they are more dependent on oil, right? And then again, in the previous articles, we've seen that though there's a change in fossil fuel energy to the renewable energy, that energy actually changes the dependence from fossil fuel to mineral based, right? We've seen in the previous newspaper analysis that Democratic Republic of Congo, Chile, Australia, China, all of these control the major minerals that are required for generating renewable energy. China being 90% control over rare earth minerals and 70% of cobalt, right? Chile, Australia controlling the lithium reserves, right? So the dependence actually changes from fossil fuel based to mineral based. That is what you need to keep in mind, that any event that is happening or any change that is happening in India has a larger consequence, and that consequence is usually borne by the countries that are less what you're capable of holding the reserves. So that is what I wanted to tell about the current editorial, right? Moving on. Counting people is not counting disaster risk. In this, they are talking about the recent 16th Finance Commission's method of calculating the disaster risk funding. Recently, there was a 16th Finance Commission, right? 16th Finance Commission is usually brought in under the Article 280, right? After every 5 years. After the 15th Finance Commission, N.K. Singh, we have 16th Finance Commission under Arvind Panagria. Under Arvind Panagria, there were certain changes that have been made in the 16th Finance Commission. Firstly, the vertical devolution was left at 41%. Right? The states wanted 50%, while the 41% was given by the 16th Finance Commission. Then there was a change in the horizontal devolution. In the horizontal devolution, there was a criteria, IPAD FT, IPAD being income, population, area, demography, forest and ecology, and then tax effort. Right? This was present in the 15th Finance Commission. Now the 16th Finance Commission has taken out the part of tax effort. Instead of tax effort, they replaced it with contribution to the GDP. Contribution to the GDP, meaning that the country that is contributing most to the GDP will have highest amount of funds released from the Finance Commission, whereas the country that is contributing less to the GDP will have less number of funds from the funding. Now that we've understood all of this, 16th Finance Commission has also brought in a new method of calculation of disaster risk funding. Disaster risk funding. And in this particular editorial, we'll be talking about the problems that are present in the disaster risk funding. Basically, 16th Finance Commission has to allocate funds based on the disaster risk in a particular state, and that disaster risk is usually calculated by the commission. Okay. Now the methodology that is used for calculation is disaster risk equals to hazard into vulnerability and exposure. These are the three aspects that are being considered in the disaster risk assessment. Now, hazard refers to the danger, right? Danger being the amount of floods that are happening, or drought being happen, or is it prone to earthquakes, right? All of these are hazards. Okay, hazards include floods, then earthquakes and droughts. All of these come part. Whereas exposure refers to the number of population that is exposed to the particular hazard, right? And vulnerability refers to the state's position in handling the hazard, meaning that if the state is capable or not to handle the particular disaster that has happened in that state is what vulnerability. Now, the problem with this calculation method is that it's not with the hazard aspect, but it is with the vulnerability and exposure aspect, right? They say that the author has taken an example of Odisha, right? Odisha, being in the east coast, faces a lot of cyclones, right? It faces the effects of a lot of cyclones, and with a lot of disaster being happen in Odisha has taken a lot of measures, be it disaster management risk or risk assessment, all of the measures that has been taken by Odisha. And despite all of these, and despite the amount of risk that is there in Odisha, the amount of funding under fund is very low for Odisha. This is why the author says that there is a problem, meaning that disaster risk fund is mainly to ensure that there is no risk at all, or there is no disaster at all. Okay, but if you look at the method of calculation of the disaster risk assessment, here you see that their exposure, let's say the exposure is there. In the exposure, they are counting the exposure using the total population. Right? They're using, or they're explaining the exposure using the total population, meaning, let's say there's a state, right? This is a state, and this is the coastal area. This is the coastal area present in the state. So if you look at the exposure of the happening, the population that is more prone to the disaster is the population that is living in the coastline, right? So the exposure is more near the coastline rather than the people that are staying here. But the calculation method includes all of the population, right? All of the population, and ensuring that there is the total amount of exposure is being reduced, right? The assessment of the exposure is actually flawed, because it is not calculating the actual amount of exposure, rather it is calculating a total amount of exposure, which reduces the exposure's gravity, right? So that is one of the aspects that is present in the exposure. Second one is vulnerability. According to the calculation method, vulnerability means money equals to safety, right? Money equals to safety and population equals to safety. It says that according to the vulnerability, a state which has more amount of money is less vulnerable, and the state which has less amount of money is more vulnerable. But the author gives a example to tell you that this is not the reality. For example, let's say Kerala. Kerala is high in money because of the amount of health sector being present there, right? And also the literacy amount is present there, and also the remittances present in Kerala. Kerala is a rich state, but Kerala has gone through intense floods. Intense floods happened, and many disasters have happened in Kerala. But then again, the amount of vulnerability of Kerala is very high because it is spending more on disaster. So Kerala needs more assessment or more funding when it comes to disaster risk funding. But according to the calculation method, Kerala being having more money will get less amount of risk. Meaning, see, Kerala having more money is considered more safe. That is why it is getting less money. This way, the entire disaster funding method is flawed, is what the author is saying. Right? In order to tackle the risk, the disaster funding goes properly or goes to the right people or the right states, the author is saying that we need to follow two aspects. One, calculating the exposure based on the actual population that is prone to exposure, right? This is one. Two, based on the amount of disasters that are happening and the amount of finances that the state is putting for disaster management. This is what the author is suggesting. Now you can use this particular editorial in GS3 paper. GS3 paper when it comes to disaster management, right? You can talk about how 16th Finance Commission's flawed method of funding the states with the disaster risk is a method or a part that is concerning, right? Then you can actually give in few of the measures that are given here. That way you can complete the understanding of what do you call the disaster management. This is the another aspect that is present in the editorial. Other than this, I guess I've come across this particular editorial. It says unexpected surge in the index of industrial production diverges from the previous data. This is not of much importance, but then again, I wanted to inform you guys about the index of industrial production and also the 8 core industries, right? I'll explain the 8 core industries and index of industrial production through the note. Right, let's go. Basically, we have two things for calculation. One is IIP, index of industrial production, and then we have 8 core industries. The editorial is saying that while the index of industrial production is increasing, the 8 core industries is decreasing. But if you actually look at the industry index of industrial production and 8 core industries, there is a high linkage. Index of industrial production includes three aspects. One is mining, manufacturing, and electricity. Manufacturing occupying the highest part, 77%, whereas electricity and mining being 14%, right? And 8 core industries include 8 industries, that is Friends C3, F being fertilizer, R being refinery, E being electricity, N natural gas, S being steel, coal, crude oil, and cement. These are all the aspects present of the 8 core industries, where fertilizer has the lowest amount of percentage and refinery has the highest amount of percentage. Fertilizer occupying 2% and this is all about IIP and ECI. IIP is released by the NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, whereas ECI is done by Office of Economic Advisor under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. They both are released monthly. They both are released monthly. Now the article is saying, or the editorial is saying, that while the India's IIP index is showing an increase, the 8 core industries are showing a decrease. But what you need to understand is that ECI makes up 40% of IIP. ECI is nothing but 40.27% of the IIP. If the IIP is increasing, so ECI should also increase. If the ECI is decreasing, then IIP also should decrease. But what you need to understand is that there's also 60% that is present in the IIP. And that IIP 60% is actually ensuring that the industries are actually on a rise and the IIP index is on a rise. That is what I wanted to mention in the said editorial, because there's no information left in the newspaper, because all of those are not really necessary for UPSC. But I wanted to ensure you guys are have a little understanding on what IIP is and what ECI is. Right? IIP is the Index of Industrial Production, which has three aspects: mining, manufacturing, electricity. And ECI is 8 core industries, having friends C3. This is the mnemonic that is usually present: fertilizer, refinery, electricity, natural gas, steel, coal, crude oil, and cement. ECI is released by the Office of Economic Advisor, and that is under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. It is released monthly, and it is 40.27% of the industry index of industrial production. And IIP is released by NSO, which is under Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. You can use this in prelims. This is important for prelims, so just keep this in mind. Right, that is all about today's newspaper. I don't think there's any other aspect that is important that I've come across. Right? You can actually see the amount of effect that is being caused by the war. Right? As I talked in the editorial, the war has a larger consequence. If you actually look at all of the aspects that are present in today's newspaper, you can see here. Trump blasts allies, tells them to get your own oil. See, USA is supposed to act as a big brother for all of the countries when you are controlling a major part. Right? When suddenly there's a crisis, USA is actually abandoning all of the people that it will support. So Trump is saying that you can go and get your own oil, and there's no need for you to depend on me. You can either buy oil or you can go wherever you want. That is what the Trump is saying. That is one of the aspects, one of the consequence of what you call the war, where you can see how the major countries are abandoning all of the other countries that are dependent on them. And right, and also chicken traders go down to margins because of what you call mostly the price hike is usually based on transport. Right? There are many aspects that are linked to the said global tension. So that is what you need to keep in mind. Other than that, I don't think there's any other aspect that is important in the newspaper today. Those are the three editorials that I felt are important for UPSC. One is the West Asian tension, which can be used for GS2 mains in the international relations, and the GS3 part, where you're talking about the disaster management, and lastly, the 8 core industries and index of industrial production, which is important for prelims. Yeah, that's all for today's newspaper. We'll meet you guys in the next session. So thank you.